Hey everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon, and today I wanted to discuss the degrees and levels of CE-5. And I think a lot of people, especially nowadays, are not too familiar that CE-5, which is Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, human-initiated contact events, are that CE-5 actually has different categories, right? And Dr. Greer outlined this very well, especially in the old days. And again, Dr. Greer has become somewhat popular nowadays, so there's a lot more people that are familiar with his work nowadays that might not have looked back at the old stuff. And even in the newer, CE-5 trainings and lectures and talks and all that stuff, I don't think he goes over all these degrees. But actually, back in the early 90s, this kind of stuff was emphasized. So I'll start first, just for some background and context, to say that in the early 90s, Dr. Steven Greer founded CSETI, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Of course, here he's attributing UFOs to extraterrestrial intelligence, just for your understanding. So in this framework, CE-5, of course, is a human-initiated contact event, and it had different categories. But CSETI was actually Dr. Steven Greer's first project, his most important project, and he didn't get into the disclosure stuff, Project Starlight and the Disclosure Project, until actually later on when he was doing this and having contact. And at that point, there were people in the intelligence community who started to approach him, and he kind of got into the whole disclosure end of things because he was trying to actually prevent interference with CE-5 events, so that people can do CE-5 and have contact and not have some kind of interaction with the military at that point. Seriously, he talks about this in some of his videos and lectures, just for that understanding. But anyways, so getting to the degrees and levels of CE-5. And again, this stuff is all in the old CSETI training materials and the CSETI Working Group Manual, and Dr. Steven Greer's first book, which he used as briefing materials for senators, congressmen, intelligence officers, and potential, Project Starlight or Disclosure Project participants, was his book. First it was actually briefing files, which became a book, I believe, in the late 90s. But the papers go back into the early 90s, and the book is called Extraterrestrial Contact, The Evidence and Implications. And I recommend this book to anybody interested in UFOs and contact. I think it's even if you don't agree with Dr. Greer, there's a lot of important stuff there, especially for its time. So again, CE-5 actually has different categories, and these different categories, I'll say off the bat before I get into them, are CE-5 of the first degree, CE-5 of the second degree, and then a CE-5, a level 1 CE-5, a level 2 CE-5, a level 3 CE-5, a level 4 CE-5, and yes, a level 5 CE-5. So first, before I get into it, I will play a video here of Dr. Greer explaining first degree CE-5 and second degree CE-5 by himself, actually. And again, this video is from the mid-90s.
Everyone here know what a close encounter of the first, second, third, and fourth kind is. Anyone who does not, raise your hand. All right. Well, first, we'll just go through. First is a daylight sighting, or a sighting within 500 feet. Second is a landing trace, a landing, electromagnetic effect, radar tape, what have you. Close encounter of the third kind, as you all know, is the sighting of a humanoid with or without a spacecraft, usually with. Close encounter of the fourth kind is when an individual is taken on board a craft. We call that a close interaction, not an abduction, because that is prejudicial in our concept. And a close encounter of the fifth kind is a new category, which we have described as a human-initiated or human cooperative event that was voluntarily and deliberately undertaken by a human. Notice that all the other categories are essentially passive. You're somewhere and something flies by and you see it within 500 feet, that's a CE-1. Someplace an event occurs and there's a landing, it's a CE-2. These are all passive. Our point is this. These peoples, and I'll use that term broadly, I hope it doesn't offend anyone, have been knocking on our back door, front door, some people said literally their front door, side door, basement, roof, for 45 years. It is time for us to answer that knock. But it must be answered with clarity. It must be answered with vision. And it must be answered with the right motivations. We will get into some of that today. Let me give you an example of close encounter of the fifth kind, or CE-5. The generic one that is plenty of places in the literature. We did a literature search and have found over 100 of these. An individual is out someplace and they see a UFO. Rather than just being dumbfounded, as most people would be, the usual response, even from a professional photographer, is to go, and that's the extent of it. What we're talking about is someone who then goes to their car and gets a flashlight, takes it out, and flashes at the craft. Guess what? It stops and comes over and flashes back. Now you would say this has not happened. This has happened many, many dozens of times. Another example. An individual is doing a laser show for a rock concert. And they inadvertently, in this case, it doesn't quite meet our definition of a CE-5, but we'll use it for example. And a UFO comes over and signals back with the laser, or simply comes over to investigate what all this noise in the sky is about. We define these as first degree and second degree CE-5s, and you'll excuse me if I obsess and compulse a little bit here. This is what doctors like to do. A close encounter of the fifth kind, first degree. There's no UFO in the area. An individual goes out deliberately using protocols to vector one in to their geographic location. Those are rather rare, but they do happen. Close encounter of the fifth kind, second degree, you just happen to be someplace, you see a UFO, but you have the presence of mind to wave, to signal with a light, to shout, to send a thought, and it interacts back with you. They're both CE-5s, but there's few orders of magnitude difference between a CE-5 first degree and second degree in terms of difficulty in causing that to happen. Why is this an important category? It's the first interactive, deliberate category. And the reason we think it's important is that if you look through the information that is out there, many people have had these experiences, have written them up, not known what they were. They were like a diamond in the rough. And what we try to do is to get the dross and the carbon off that diamond and look and see what its value might be. And what we have found is that its value is in this, that humans can say, stop, and come and interact with us voluntarily, and they will. A high percentage of cases where people have taken the initiative to do this, a UFO and or its occupants have indeed voluntarily interacted. If we do not see that this is possible and therefore attempt it, it will never happen. It's like everything. Nothing can happen until we create it here first. And we're creating a reality, and in the past have created a reality that has been primarily involuntary and passive and reactive. What we want to move into is a reality that is proactive, deliberate, voluntary, cooperative. This is a order of magnitude jump. No longer are we talking about doing passive retrospective research. And let me mention what that refers to in the medical model. Retrospective research is when you look back and you do studies through case files and case histories. And almost all UFO research up to this time has been retrospective. Someone has a sighting, or a report, or an investigator goes out and takes the report. Someone has a close interaction or an abduction. Someone does a hypnosis session or what have you, and they find out what happened. Those are important. We must continue retrospective research. But what we have forgotten is the pure hardcore stuff. It's called proactive research or...
So again, now you'll see there that, this is Dr. Greer in the mid-90s. So you can see there's a kind of little difference of his demeanor and presentation of this work. But that was the vibe back then. And again, back in these days, CE-5 was a bit different. There was actually more detail and meticulous before it became more of what it was today. But again, I'll kind of reiterate what Dr. Greer was saying and get into the levels of CE-5. So first degree CE-5 is there's no UFOs in the area, and you do contact modalities, the CE-5 protocols, or any other method of contact you have, and then a UFO comes into the area. So the UFO sighting and encounter is happening because of something you did. So that's a CE-5 of the first degree. A CE-5 of the second degree is when there's a UFO in the area and you see it, and then you somehow try to interact with it, whether by, shining a light at it or playing radio tones to it or thinking to it especially. And then the UFO, which was somehow passing by, now begins to interact. That's a CE-5 of the second degree. Now, I want to get into the levels of CE-5. And these levels of CE-5 can be found in the CE-5 working group materials, or the CSETI working group materials, the early CSETI stuff, the old school audio tapes of the CSETI training materials, of the audio files. It's in there as well in great detail. And that was actually recorded by Sherry Adamak. And now these levels of CE-5, there are different levels now. So a level 1 CE-5 is when during a CE-5 of the first or second degree, the craft, you can see a craft kind of in the distance and it interacts somehow. Maybe it stops, maybe it flashes and signals, or it somehow interacts with you from a distance. That's a level 1 CE-5. A level 2 CE-5 is when during a CE-5, there's a UFO that comes in and it begins to hover, and or there's a near landing. So the UFO actually, in this case, comes very close and hovers, or there's a near landing. So that's a level 2 CE-5. A level 3 CE-5 is when an entity emerges from the UFO. So a level 3 CE-5 would be you're having a CE-5, and then very similar to a close encounter of the third kind, the level 3 CE-5 would be that there's some kind of entity that emerges from the craft or UFO. And it could be debatable whether there's some kind of holographic projection of an entity in some kind of beam of light, or whether that's unclear if that is considered of a level 3 CE-5, or it has to be the actual biological being. But I would argue we probably don't even know the difference at this point. So I'll leave it at that. A level 4 CE-5 is when there's an onboard experience. So you're having a CE-5 event, and the level 4 CE-5 is then you somehow get on board a UFO or an ET craft, right? You get onto a vehicle of the other somehow. That would be very similar to Close Encounter of the Fourth Kind and or abduction onboard experience. But in the context of you're having a CE-5 experience and you get on a UFO, that's a level 4 CE-5. Now, a level 5 CE-5 is when you're having a CE-5 experience and you manage to get onto a UFO, UAP, ET craft, what have you, interdimensional, hyperspatial traveling craft with UFO intelligence, and it leaves. So you're on a craft and you're doing a CE-5, or it's within the context of CE-5. There's an onboard experience, and then the object leaves the area and you're on the UFO for any amount of time, a minute, 10 minutes, a month, whatever it is. That happened, and that's a level 5 CE-5. Again, I think it's really interesting that all these levels, degrees, and layers to CE-5. And I would argue most people are not familiar with this, especially even within the CE-5 community. Unless you actually went through all of the old school CSETI and CE-5 training materials, you're not going to have come across this. Again, especially nowadays, because Dr. Steven Greer does not teach or talk about this as much. This is a very kind of like 90s old school vintage CE-5 thing. I think people in those days took CE-5 very seriously, because mostly to acquire the information, you'd have to go to a workshop or a conference or ambassador to the universe training. So you're at that point, you're pretty invested. So you're taking the materials very seriously, and likely in those cases, you're actually going out with Dr. Steven Greer and other people in the field to do the actual CE-5 work. So people took it very seriously in those days, the CE-5 initiative and CE-5 work in general. Whereas nowadays, you can just get an app or go online and watch something on YouTube and learn CE-5, and maybe do it or not by yourself, maybe take it seriously or not by yourself, and may have something happen. Where you're less invested in this kind of new day and age where you don't have to take anything seriously. Yeah, to the extent where, like, if in the old days you went to an event, which you went out of your way to go to that event, you may have had to take off of work, did it on your weekend, spent your own dime to travel somewhere, you went to a workshop, you learned the stuff, and you probably went out in the field with other researchers and or Greer and other people and did the work. So you're much more invested in that degree. And where here nowadays, you can come across this stuff online, and you're not very invested in it, right? For maybe a lot of people. Again, so this is kind of my rant on the degrees and the levels of CE-5. I find this stuff fascinating. I think it's very important. I think this old school 1990s CSETI stuff is important for any UFO researcher to know, even just the frameworks and the thinking that was going on back in those days. And again, I'm going to argue, and what people can think whatever they think, but Dr. Greer was pretty ahead of his time, and especially regarding the way contact works and how it should be operated, and contact field work. Right, he had protocols and these guidelines and these categories of contact. Again, so I think that this is important, especially if you're interested in contact. You don't have to agree with the stuff, but I think these are important frameworks that you can work with, even mentally, to kind of have an idea of the differences of the levels of contact, how contact can occur, and again, the different degrees that are discussed here. So I hope people appreciated this. I would encourage people to go back and look at this old material. If you have requests or anything, put it in the comments. I'm definitely going to be doing a lot more videos covering some of this other material, the early like 1990s CSETI stuff, the early CE-5 initiative training materials. I'm definitely going to be doing a video that's covering the CE-5 working group materials, or the CSETI working group materials, that's going over all the stuff. So I will be doing a video that outlines the entire materials. That's not going to be in too much detail though, because there's 120 pages, and I can't go over page by page, but I will be doing highlights. So I appreciate you guys for tuning into this one. I hope you appreciated it, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.